The cardboard box slipped from my weathered hands, hitting the sidewalk with a wet thud that echoed through my bones like a death knell. Soup cans rolled across the cracked pavement like silver coins scattered from a broken purse, each metallic clang a symphony of failure. I watched them disappear into storm drains and under parked cars, spinning away from me like tiny planets abandoning their orbit. Each one represented a meal that wouldn't reach someone who needed it tonight. Each one was a promise I'd made and couldn't keep. My knees buckled, not from the weight of the box, though it had been heavy enough to make my arthritic joints scream in protest. I'd carried heavier loads in my 67 years of living. No, this collapse came from something deeper, more devastating. It came from the crushing realization that I'd finally hit the wall I'd been running toward for 3 years. How did I get here? The thought crashed through my mind like a wave against rocks. How did feeding people become the thing that's killing me? I pressed my palm against the rough brick wall beside me, feeling each ridge and valley in the mortar like a topographical map of my own desperation. The building was old, probably built when I was still young and believed the world made sense. When I thought hard work and good intentions were enough to solve any problem. A businessman in an expensive suit stepped around me without making eye contact, his leather shoes clicking past the scattered soup cans like they were debris from someone else's shipwreck. To him, I was just another invisible old woman having some kind of episode on the sidewalk. He probably assumed I was homeless myself, and the irony wasn't lost on me that he might be right. The rain started then, as if the sky itself was weeping for what I'd lost. Each drop felt like a tiny hammer against my skull, a reminder of every promise I'd made and broken, every stomach that would remain empty because I wasn't strong enough anymore. The water mixed with something salty on my cheeks and I realized I was crying too. My reflection stared back at me from a growing puddle, gray hair escaping from a worn headband that had seen better decades, lines etched deep around eyes that had witnessed too much hope and too much heartbreak. I looked like what I was, an old woman who'd bitten off more than she could chew. An old woman who'd let her heart write checks her body couldn't cash. But they were counting on me. Harold with his pale blue eyes and gentle hands that shook when he tried to light a cigarette. Maria with her baby who cooed and smiled despite sleeping in a car. Frank with his purple heart and his nightmares and his quiet dignity that never wavered even when everything else did. They'd been counting on me every single day for the past 3 years, through seasons of plenty and seasons of want, through my good days and my bad ones. They'd trusted me to show up when no one else would. And I was about to let them all down. This story is already stirring something in your heart. I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now and which city or state are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far this story is reaching. I suppose I should start by telling you who I am. Or rather, who I was before everything changed, before I became the woman crying over soup cans on a sidewalk in the rain. My name is Margaret Rose Sullivan, though most people have called me Maggie since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. I'm 67 years old, born in 1958 when Eisenhower was president and the world seemed simpler, though I suspect that's just the rose-colored glasses of childhood talking. Until 3 years ago, I lived what most would consider a perfectly ordinary life, the kind that doesn't make headlines or inspire movies, but forms the backbone of small-town America. I had my small apartment on Maple Street, a cozy 2-bedroom place with windows that faced east so I could watch the sunrise with my morning coffee. I had my weekly bridge games with the ladies from St. Catharines, Helen, who always brought butterscotch candies in her purse, and Dorothy, who told the same stories about her grandson's baseball games but with such joy that nobody minded hearing them twice. I had my routine that kept me anchored to something resembling normalcy. Grocery shopping on Fridays at precisely 10 a.m. when the store was quiet and I could take my time reading labels and comparing prices. Laundry on Tuesdays because that's when the laundromat was empty except for Mrs. Chin, who spoke broken English but perfect kindness. Church on Sundays in the third pew from the front left side, where Jim and I had sat for 23 years of marriage. The lines on my hands tell the story of 6 decades of hard living and harder loving. The scar that runs from my left thumb to my wrist. That's from when I grabbed a hot pan without thinking, trying to keep 4-year-old Danny from burning himself when he reached for the stove. The calluses on my palms are souvenirs from double shifts at the diner, when standing on my feet for 16 hours was the price of keeping my children fed and clothed after Jim passed. These hands have changed 1,000 diapers, packed countless lunches, braided hair for school pictures, and held my husband's hand as he took his last breath. They've kneaded bread at 5 a.m. before work, folded laundry by lamplight after midnight, and counted pennies so many times the copper seemed to wear off on my fingertips. My body carries the evidence of those years like a roadmap of resilience. The way my left hip protests when I stand too quickly. That's from a car accident in 1987 when a drunk driver ran a red light and sent me spinning across an intersection. I was more worried about the groceries scattered across the back seat than my own injuries, because we were living paycheck to paycheck and I couldn't afford to replace that food. The reading glasses that seem to migrate around my house like they have a mind of their own, usually ending up in the refrigerator or the bathroom medicine cabinet when I've been distracted by worry or fatigue. The way I have to grip the handrail when I climb stairs now. Something that would have seemed impossible when I was chasing 3 children up and down those same steps 30 years ago. But it's not just my body that tells the story of my years. It's the photographs on my mantle. Jim in his wedding suit, grinning like he'd won the lottery instead of just marrying a waitress from the wrong side of town. Our children at various stages of growing up, gap-toothed grins giving way to braces, then graduation caps, then wedding photos of their own. I remember the exact moment everything shifted. The way some people remember where they were when Kennedy was shot or when the Challenger exploded. It was a Tuesday morning in March, one of those days when winter was finally loosening its grip and you could smell spring in the air like a promise. I was walking back from Peterson's Market with my weekly groceries, bread, milk, eggs, the necessities that filled my small refrigerator and smaller life. That's when I saw him. An elderly man, maybe my age or perhaps older. It's hard to tell when someone's been living rough, when the elements have carved years into their face like weather carving canyons into stone. He was sitting on the ground outside First National Bank with his back against the brick wall, holding a piece of cardboard that simply read "Hungry," in black marker letters that had started to blur from previous rains. When did I stop seeing them? The question hit me like a physical blow. I'd walked past that same corner dozens of times, maybe hundreds, without really looking. How long had he been there? How many others had I stepped around without acknowledging their existence? The realization was devastating. I'd become one of those people who look through the homeless instead of at them, who treat human suffering like background noise in the symphony of their own concerns. I'd let comfort and routine build walls around my heart that I didn't even know existed. That morning I stopped. I looked into his eyes, pale blue like my late husband's, like chips of winter sky, and saw something that shattered whatever comfortable distance I'd maintained from the world's sharp edges. I saw dignity struggling against despair. I saw someone's father, someone's husband, someone's son reduced to begging for the most basic human need. But more than that, I saw myself. I saw how thin the line was between his reality and mine, how a few different choices or a run of bad luck could have put me on that corner with my own cardboard sign. Growing up in the 1960s and 70s, I learned about hunger firsthand, though we never called it that. We called it tightening our belts, or making do, or counting our blessings. Anything but admitting that sometimes there simply wasn't enough. My father, Robert O'Malley, worked at Hammond Steel Mill until it closed in 1962, taking with it the dreams and livelihoods of half our neighborhood. He was a proud man with hands like leather and a laugh that could shake the windows, but when the mill shut down, something in him shut down too. He'd sit at the kitchen table in the mornings, staring at newspaper wanted ads that offered half the pay for twice the work if they offered anything at all. My mother, Catherine, took in laundry to make ends meet. Our basement became a steam-filled cave of other people's clothes, and the smell of soap and starch became the perfume of our poverty. She'd stand at the ironing board for hours, pressing wrinkles out of shirts and dresses while collecting them in her own face, aging years and months as she tried to hold our family together with determination and elbow grease. We weren't poor by our own standards. We had a roof that mostly kept out the rain and usually enough food to keep the hollow feeling at bay. But I remember nights when dinner was just bread and butter, and my mother would claim she wasn't hungry so there'd be enough for the rest of us. I remember the way she'd push food around her plate without eating it, making conversation to distract us from noticing her sacrifice. Charity begins at home, she used to say, spooning extra soup into my bowl while leaving her own half empty. But it doesn't end there. Those words followed me into adulthood like a melody you can't get out of your head. I carried them with me when I married Jim Sullivan in 1975, a June wedding in St. Catharines with daisies from our neighbor's garden and a dress my mother had sewn from fabric she'd bought on clearance. Jim was a good man, the kind of steady, reliable person who kept his promises and his temper in equal measure. He had calloused hands from working construction and a laugh that could fill a room with joy even when there wasn't much to laugh about. He'd come home covered in dust and cement, but he'd always stop to kiss me before washing up, leaving little white handprints on my waist like he was marking me as his. We had 3 children in 4 years. Michael in 1976, Sarah in 1978, and then little Danny in 1980. Our house became a symphony of chaos and love, the constant mathematics of stretching a dollar until it screamed for mercy. Diapers and baby food and shoes that seemed to shrink overnight as growing feet demanded more space than our budget could provide. Jim worked construction during the week and painted houses on weekends, coming home so tired he'd fall asleep on his dinner plate if we let him. I worked part-time at Mel's Diner, serving coffee and pie to truckers and businessmen who left tips that meant the difference between paying the electric bill and explaining to the children why we were eating dinner by candlelight. But we were happy. Poor as church mice and twice as resourceful, but happy in the way that only people who've learned to find joy in small things can be. Saturday mornings when all 5 of us would pile into our second-hand Ford and drive to the lake for picnics that consisted of peanut butter sandwiches and dreams. Christmas mornings when the presents under our scraggly tree were more about imagination than expense. Homemade toys and hand-knitted scarves that meant more than anything money could buy. The children grew like weeds in good soil despite our financial struggles or maybe because of them. They learned to appreciate what they had, to share without being asked, to understand that love doesn't require a price tag but sometimes requires sacrifice. Michael was our serious one, always with his nose in a book, reading by flashlight under his covers when we thought he was asleep. Sarah had a heart bigger than our small house, always bringing home stray cats and classmates who needed a friend. And Danny, sweet mischievous Danny, could charm his way out of trouble and into our hearts with a smile that was pure Jim. Then on a Tuesday in April 1992 our world ended. Jim was working on a construction site downtown, installing drywall in what would become a fancy office building. The foreman said later that he was being careful, following all the safety protocols, wearing his hard hat and his tool belt like always. But sometimes being careful isn't enough. Sometimes the universe decides to remind you that life is fragile and luck is fickle and love doesn't provide protection against falling scaffolding. The call came at 2:47 in the afternoon. I remember the exact time because I was watching the clock at the diner, counting the minutes until my shift ended and I could go home to start dinner. The phone rang in the kitchen and Mel answered it with his usual gruff hello, but his face changed as he listened. He covered the receiver with his flour-dusted hand and called my name in a voice I'd never heard before. "Maggie, honey, you need to take this call." The voice on the other end was professional, kind, devastating. There had been an accident. Jim was at Memorial Hospital. I needed to come right away. The next few hours passed in a blur of antiseptic smells and fluorescent lights and medical terms that sounded like a foreign language. Traumatic brain injury. Internal bleeding. Critical condition. Words that bounced off my understanding like hail against a window. I sat in the waiting room with Michael, Sarah, and Danny watching my children try to process the incomprehensible. Michael, 16 and convinced he was almost grown, kept asking practical questions about insurance and bills and what would happen next. Sarah, 14 and still my baby in so many ways, held Danny's hand and whispered promises that everything would be okay. Danny, just 12, stared at the floor and didn't say anything at all. Jim died at 11:23 that night without regaining consciousness. One moment he was there, breathing with the help of machines, and the next he was gone, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like the world had forgotten how to make sound. I was 44 years old, suddenly alone with 3 children and a mortgage that felt like a mountain I'd never climb. The life insurance helped but not enough. Just enough to bury my husband and buy us a few months of breathing room before the bills started demanding attention again. The math was simple and terrifying. I could work at the diner during the day and clean offices at night, sleeping in fragments and running on coffee and determination. Or I could watch my children's futures disappear along with their father. My sister Carol thought I was crazy. "You're killing yourself, Maggie," she'd say during our Sunday phone calls, her voice tinged with worry and frustration. "The kids need their mother alive, not dead from exhaustion." But what choice did I have? I'd made promises to those children when they were born, and I'd renewed those promises at Jim's funeral when I looked into their faces and saw their father's eyes staring back at me. They would graduate. They would have opportunities one never had. They would know that when the world knocked them down, they had someone in their corner who would never stop fighting for them. So I fought. I worked 16-hour days and collapsed into bed fully clothed, too tired to change into pajamas. I attended parent-teacher conferences on 2 hours of sleep and made birthday cakes at midnight because I couldn't afford to buy them. I stretched ground beef with rice and beans, darned socks until they were more thread than original fabric, and performed miracles with clearance rack clothes and garage sale treasures. The children never complained. Michael got a job stocking shelves at the grocery store and handed over his paycheck without being asked. Sarah babysat neighborhood kids and helped with Danny's homework when I was too tired to see straight. Danny learned to make his own lunch and do his own laundry and ask for very little beyond what we could provide. And somehow, miraculously, we made it. Michael graduated valedictorian and earned a scholarship to the state university, where he studied education because he wanted to help other kids the way his teachers had helped him. Sarah followed 2 years later, choosing nursing because she'd learned to care for people by watching me care for our family. Danny was the last to leave, heading to trade school to learn carpentry because he'd inherited his father's love of building things that would last. They all married eventually, found partners who loved them and understood where they came from. They gave me grandchildren who called me Nana and filled my small house with laughter during visits that were never long enough. They moved to different states for better opportunities, following dreams that I'd worked 2 jobs to make possible. I was proud of them, so proud it sometimes felt like my chest might burst from the sheer magnitude of it. I was also profoundly, devastatingly alone. The years after they left were the hardest, not because I regretted their success, but because I'd spent so long defining myself by what I could do for others that I'd forgotten who I was when nobody needed me. I'd been Maggie the wife, Maggie the mother, Maggie the provider. But who was just Maggie? I filled the empty spaces with routine because routine doesn't abandon you or grow up and move away. Bridge on Wednesdays with Helen and Dorothy, who were dealing with their own versions of empty nest syndrome. Grocery shopping on Fridays when the store was quiet and I could take my time, reading every label twice because I had nowhere else to be. Church on Sundays where I prayed for my children's happiness and my own sense of purpose. I volunteered at the library, helped with the annual coat drive, and kept my house clean enough that if my children visited unexpectedly, I wouldn't be embarrassed. I watched game shows and read romance novels and tried to convince myself that this peaceful, predictable life was exactly what I'd earned after decades of struggle. But inside, something was withering like a plant that's forgotten how to reach for sunlight. I felt like I was disappearing, becoming one of those invisible older women who exist on the margins of other people's lives. My grown children called dutifully every Sunday, but they had their own problems, their own dreams, their own children to worry about. I was proud of their independence, but it left me wondering what my purpose was now that the most important job of my life was finished. The loneliness was a physical thing sometimes, settling in my chest like a stone that made it hard to breathe. I'd catch myself talking to the photographs on my mantle, having conversations with ghosts and memories. I'd cook dinner for one and eat it standing at the kitchen counter because sitting at the table by myself felt too much like admitting defeat. That's the woman I was when I met Harold. The man with the cardboard sign who would change everything. Lost in my own quiet desperation, invisible to myself and everyone else, slowly disappearing into a routine that felt more like dying than living. Looking back now, I think I needed to find him as much as he needed to be found. Maybe more. After I met Harold, something fundamental shifted in the architecture of my days. The careful routine I'd built like a fortress against loneliness suddenly felt like a prison, and Harold's pale blue eyes were the key that unlocked something I hadn't even realized was trapped inside me. Instead of walking directly home from Peterson's Market like I had for years, I started taking a detour past the bank corner. Sometimes Harold was there, sitting against the brick wall with his weathered cardboard sign and his dignity wrapped around him like an invisible coat. Sometimes the corner was empty, leaving me to wonder where he'd gone and whether he was safe. When he was there, I'd stop and sit beside him on the cold concrete, my grocery bags forming a small barrier between us and the indifferent world that flowed past us like water around stones. I'd share whatever I had. A sandwich I'd packed for lunch, some fruit from my weekly shopping, occasionally a thermos of soup I'd made the night before just in case. "You don't have to do this," Harold would say, but I could see the relief in his eyes when I settled beside him, the way his shoulders relaxed as if he'd been holding his breath until he saw me coming. Harold told me his story in pieces, scattered across weeks of brief conversations like breadcrumbs, leading me deeper into an understanding of how quickly a life can unravel. He'd been a mechanic for 37 years, working at Morrison's auto shop until arthritis made it impossible to grip the tools that had been extensions of his hands for most of his adult life. His wife, Eleanor, had died of cancer 3 years earlier. 42 years we were married, he told me one gray morning, his voice soft with memory. She made the best apple pie you ever tasted. Used to say I loved her pie more than I loved her, but that wasn't true. Nothing was sweeter than her smile when she'd watch me eat it. The medical bills from Eleanor's illness had consumed their savings, their retirement account, their hopes for growing old together in the little house they'd bought when they were young and thought love could conquer anything. When she died, Harold discovered that love can't conquer medical debt or mortgage payments or the simple mathematics of survival on a fixed income. I never thought I'd be here, he said, gesturing at his cardboard sign with hands that shook from more than just the cold. I worked my whole life. Paid my taxes. Went to church on Sundays. Voted in every election since I turned 18. And now? Now you're invisible, I thought, watching businesspeople step around him without making eye contact. Just like I was before I met you. Through Harold, I started noticing others who had somehow slipped through the cracks of a system that was supposed to catch them when they fell. The young woman who sat outside Melman's pharmacy with a baby in her arms, speaking Spanish to anyone who would listen and English to those who wouldn't. The veteran who slept in the doorway of the closed shoe store, his purple heart pinned to a jacket that had seen better decades. The teenager who should have been in school but instead spent his days collecting aluminum cans and sleeping in parks. Each face became a story. Each story became a person who mattered, who had dreams and fears and memories of better times. Each person became a weight I carried home with me, a responsibility I hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. I started bringing more food. Not just for Harold but for whoever needed it. I'd make extra soup on Sundays, enough to fill 3 thermoses instead of 1. I'd buy additional sandwiches when I stopped at the deli, pack granola bars in my purse like some people pack tissues or mints. My grocery bills doubled, then tripled, but I managed by cutting back on other things that suddenly seemed less important. I didn't need cable television when there were people who didn't have homes to put televisions in. I didn't need new clothes when my old ones were perfectly serviceable. I didn't need dinners out when I could cook at home and have leftovers to share. The first sign that I was wading into waters deeper than I could navigate came on a rainy Thursday in June. I'd brought sandwiches for 5 people. Harold, Maria, the young woman with the baby, Frank, the veteran, Tommy, the teenager, and a new face I'd started seeing around the bus station. But word had somehow spread through the invisible network that connects people who live on society's margins, and 12 people showed up. I watched them look at the small bag of food I'd brought, then at each other, and the math was devastating. 5 sandwiches, 12 hungry people, and me standing there like a fraud who'd promised more than she could deliver. It's okay, Harold said, stepping forward with the natural authority of someone who'd been hungry longer than the rest. Well, sure. We'll make it work. And they did. They tore those 5 sandwiches into pieces smaller than appetizers, divided the fruit into portions that wouldn't satisfy a child, and smiled like they were grateful for the crumbs. But I saw the disappointment they tried to hide behind polite thank yous. I saw the way they touched their stomachs when they thought no one was looking. I saw the mathematics of hunger calculating how many hours until their next meal, and the answer was always too many. This isn't enough, I thought as I walked home that day, my empty bag feeling heavier than when it had been full. This isn't nearly enough. That night, I called my daughter Sarah in Phoenix, where she worked as a nurse and raised 2 children who would never know what it felt like to wonder where their next meal was coming from. "Mom, that's wonderful that you're helping people," she said when I told her about Harold and the others. I could hear her making dinner in the background, the comfortable sounds of a life that worked according to plan. "But you need to be careful. You're not responsible for solving everyone's problems." But I felt responsible. Every face I'd seen, every story I'd heard, every empty stomach I couldn't fill, they followed me home and kept me awake at night. I'd lie in bed calculating how many more sandwiches I could afford, how many more people I could help if I just cut back a little more on my own needs. I started visiting the Riverside Food Bank, a converted warehouse where volunteers sorted donated cans and expired produce with the efficiency of people who understood that hunger doesn't wait for perfect solutions. The coordinator, a tired-looking woman named Janet with gray roots showing through brown hair dye, explained that they were always short-handed and underfunded. "We do what we can," she said, gesturing at pallets of dented cans and day-old bread, "but the need is enormous. We're seeing families who never thought they'd need help. Teachers, construction workers, people working 2 jobs who still can't make ends meet. And then there are the ones who've been struggling for so long they've stopped asking for help. I started volunteering there 3 days a week, sorting donations and packing boxes for families whose names I'd never know but whose stories I could imagine. The work was physically demanding, lifting 50-pound bags of rice, standing for hours at sorting tables, loading boxes into cars driven by people who thanked me with their eyes because words were too difficult. But it felt like I was doing something real, something that mattered in a way that bridge games and grocery shopping never had. For the first time since my children left home, I woke up with a sense of purpose that pulled me out of bed instead of pushing me through another day. But it still wasn't enough. The people I'd met on the streets, Harold and Maria and Frank and Tommy, they didn't come to the food bank. They couldn't navigate the paperwork that proved they deserved help, or they were too proud to stand in lines with their neighbors, or they had transportation issues that made the trip impossible, or they'd been turned away for not having the right address or the right identification or the right answers to questions that seemed designed to exclude rather than include. The system is broken, I realized as I watched a woman leave the food bank empty-handed because she couldn't prove she lived in our county. And while we're trying to fix it with forms and regulations and good intentions, people are starving. So I started bringing food directly to them. Not just to Harold's Corner, but to all the places where the homeless gathered like shadows fleeing the light. Under the bridge that carried traffic over the river, behind the grocery store where dumpsters provided windbreaks against the cold, in the park where they could sleep on benches until the police moved them along. I'd load up my old cart, the same one I'd used to haul laundry to the basement when my children were small, with sandwiches and soup and fruit and bottles of water. I'd walk from location to location like a one-woman relief effort, dispensing food and conversation and the simple acknowledgement that they existed. The physical toll was immediate and brutal. My hip, which had been manageable for years with occasional aspirin and stubborn denial, started screaming in protest. The accident from 1987 had left me with arthritis that flared when I pushed too hard, and apparently walking 8 miles a day while pulling a loaded cart qualified as pushing too hard. My feet, unaccustomed to pounding pavement for hours at a time, developed blisters that turned into calluses that cracked and bled. I learned to layer bandages and wear 2 pairs of socks and soak my feet in Epsom salt baths that left my bathroom smelling like a medical clinic. My back ached from the constant pulling and lifting, from bending over to talk to people sitting on sidewalks, from sleeping poorly because my mind wouldn't stop calculating how many more meals I could provide if I just worked a little harder. But the emotional reward was intoxicating. The gratitude in their eyes when they saw me coming, the way Harold's face would light up like Christmas morning when he spotted my cart turning the corner. The way Maria would cry when I brought formula for her baby, speaking rapid Spanish that I didn't understand but felt in my heart. The way Frank would salute me with tears in his eyes, this proud veteran who'd served his country only to be abandoned by it. It was addictive, that feeling of being needed, of making a difference in the most direct way possible. I'd spent years feeling invisible and useless, and suddenly I was essential to dozens of people who depended on me to survive. I started walking farther, carrying more food and visiting more locations. My route expanded from 2 miles to 5, then to 8, then to 10. I'd leave my apartment at dawn with my cart loaded down like a pack mule, and I'd return after dark, exhausted but fulfilled in a way I hadn't felt since my children were young and needed me for everything. My children started to worry, their weekly phone calls taking on a tone of concern that I pretended not to notice. "Mom, you're doing too much," Michael said during one of our Sunday conversations. I could hear his own children playing in the background, the sounds of a life that was working according to plan. "You're not 25 anymore. What happens if you get hurt out there?" "I'm fine," I told him, which was only partially true. I was fine in the ways that mattered. My purpose was clear, my days had meaning, my heart felt full even when my body felt empty. But I couldn't stop. Every time I considered scaling back, I'd remember Harold's face when he told me he hadn't eaten in 2 days. I'd think about Maria's baby and wonder if she'd found formula. I'd remember Frank's stories about Vietnam and how he'd been trained to leave no man behind, and I'd apply that philosophy to my civilian mission. If I don't do this, who will? The question followed me through my daily route, through sleepless nights when my hip throbbed and my feet burned, through mornings when I could barely get out of bed but force myself up anyway because people were counting on me. My body began to betray me in small ways that accumulated like compound interest. I'd wake up in the morning and have to sit on the edge of my bed for several minutes before I could stand, waiting for my joints to remember how to work. My hands developed a tremor that made it difficult to hold my coffee cup steady, though I blamed it on too much caffeine and not enough sleep. I developed a persistent cough that I attributed to the weather, even though it continued through summer and into fall. I'd catch glimpses of myself in store windows as I walked my route and be startled by the woman looking back, thinner than I remembered, older than my years, wearing exhaustion like an expensive coat she couldn't afford but couldn't take off. But I kept walking. 10 miles a day, sometimes 12, sometimes 15 when someone told me about a new camp under a different overpass or behind an abandoned building. Through rain that soaked through my jacket and turned my cartwheels to squeaking protests. Through snow that made every step a negotiation between momentum and gravity. Through blazing summer heat that left me dizzy and dehydrated but determined. I walked through days when my hip hurt so badly I had to stop and rest every few blocks, leaning against buildings and pretending to check my watch while I waited for the pain to subside. I walked through nights when I'd collapse into bed fully clothed, too tired to change into pajamas, too exhausted to care about comfort. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in November, one of those gray days when the sky looked like old dishwater and the air tasted like winter's approach. I'd loaded my cart with enough food for 30 people. Sandwiches I'd made at 4 a.m., soup I'd cooked in batches and portioned into containers, fruit I'd bought with my grocery money, blankets I'd purchased with the money I'd been saving for a new winter coat. The cart was heavier than usual, loaded down with hope and good intentions and the weight of 30 people's expectations. The first few blocks were manageable, though I had to stop twice to readjust the load and give my hip a chance to catch up with my determination. But as I walked, the weight seemed to multiply exponentially. What had felt manageable at home became unbearable by mile 3. My hip locked up around mile 4, sending shooting pains down my leg that made me gasp and grab onto a lamppost for support. My breathing became labored and I started seeing spots at the edges of my vision like tiny black flies dancing just out of reach. Just a little farther, I told myself, the way I'd been telling myself for months. They're counting on you. Harold is probably waiting at his corner. Maria might be out of formula. Frank might not have eaten since yesterday. That's when the wheel on my cart broke. I heard it before I felt it. A sharp crack like a bone snapping followed by the grinding sound of metal against concrete. One moment I was pushing forward with grim determination. The next I was stumbling as the cart tilted sideways, spilling its contents across the sidewalk like entrails from a wounded animal. Sandwiches scattered across the wet pavement, their plastic wrapping offering no protection against the puddles that had formed in the cracks. Soup containers burst open, sending tomato and chicken broth streaming towards storm drains like red and yellow rivers. Apples rolled into the street where they were flattened by passing cars. Blankets soaked up dirty water until they were too heavy to lift. I looked at the destruction, 30 meals turned into garbage, at the hopes and promises scattered like broken glass, and felt something break inside me too. Not just physically, though my body was clearly beyond its limits. Something deeper shattered, some fundamental belief that good intentions and determination were enough to fix problems larger than myself. A passing jogger stopped to help me gather the scattered items, her face bright with the health and energy I remembered having once upon a time. She was maybe 30, with expensive running shoes and workout clothes that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. "Are you okay?" she asked, and I realized I was crying. The tears came from somewhere deeper than disappointment, deeper than physical pain. They came from the place where I'd stored 3 years of worry and exhaustion and the growing realization that I was one old woman trying to solve problems that required armies. Oh, I wanted to tell her. I'm not okay. I'm failing everyone who depends on me, and I don't know how to stop without letting them down completely. Instead, I thanked her for her help and limped home, pulling my broken cart behind me like a wounded animal dragging itself to a place where it could die in private. That night, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the evidence of my failure, and for the first time in 3 years, I wondered if my mother had been wrong about charity not ending at home. The broken cart leaned against the wall like a monument to my limitations. Its twisted wheel hung at an impossible angle, and the handle had bent where I'd gripped it too tightly during the fall. It looked as defeated as I felt, as broken as my promises to 30 people who would go hungry because I'd been too proud to admit I was just one old woman trying to move mountains with a teaspoon. My hip throbbed with each heartbeat, a steady reminder that 67-year-old bodies aren't designed for the kind of punishment I'd been inflicting on mine. My hands shook as I tried to hold a cup of tea, The tremor that had started months ago now too obvious to blame on caffeine or cold weather. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the anguish in my chest, the crushing weight of dreams and expectations I couldn't carry anymore. I'd made promises I couldn't keep to people who had nothing left but hope. I'd let my pride and my need to be needed override my common sense and my body's increasingly desperate pleas for mercy. This is what happens when you try to be someone you're not, I thought, staring at my reflection in the dark window above the sink. The woman looking back was a stranger, gaunt, exhausted, wearing defeat like a shroud. This is what happens when you forget your place in the world. I thought about Harold waiting at his corner tomorrow, watching for a cart that wouldn't come. I thought about Maria and her baby, Frank with his purple heart and his nightmares, Tommy with his collection of aluminum cans and his dreams of getting clean. I thought about all the faces I'd memorized over 3 years of walking, all the stories I'd collected like prayer beads. They trusted me. They'd counted on me when the system failed them, when their families abandoned them, when the world decided they were disposable. And now I was going to abandon them too, not because I wanted to but because my body had finally staged a revolt I couldn't ignore. The phone rang at 8:47 p.m., its shrill sound cutting through my spiral of self-recrimination like a knife through silence. I almost didn't answer it. I couldn't bear to hear the disappointment in my children's voices when I told them I'd given up, that their mother who'd raised them to never quit had finally found her breaking point. But something made me reach for it. Maybe habit, maybe hope, maybe just the ingrained politeness of a generation that believed you always answered the phone when it rang. Is this Margaret Sullivan? The voice was young, female, uncertain in the way of people who aren't sure they have the right number or the right words. Yes, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. My name is Jessica Chin. I'm a social work student at the university. I've been hearing about you. I closed my eyes, waiting for the lecture about proper channels and professional boundaries and liability issues. Waiting for someone to tell me that what I'd been doing was wrong, dangerous, unsustainable. All the things I already knew but had been too stubborn to acknowledge. I've been talking to some of the people you've been helping, she continued, and I could hear paper rustling in the background as if she were reading from notes. Harold told me about you. And Maria, the young woman with the baby. And Frank, the veteran. They're going to tell me to stop, I thought, my heart sinking even further than I'd thought possible. They're going to make this official, put regulations and restrictions on it, and I'll lose them all. I'm calling because I want to help, Jessica said, and the words didn't compute at first. I'd been braced for criticism for being told I was doing everything wrong, that I was an untrained amateur meddling in situations I didn't understand. Instead, this stranger was asking to help. I don't understand, I managed, sitting down heavily in my kitchen chair. You're feeding people who fall through the cracks, Jessica said, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. People who can't or won't go to the traditional services. People who've been failed by every system that's supposed to help them. What you're doing is incredible, but you can't do it alone. No one can. Tell her about the broken cart, the rational part of my mind insisted. Tell her about the soup cans rolling into the street and the sandwiches soaking up dirty water. Tell her you're a failure who couldn't even protect 30 meals from her own limitations. Instead, I found myself talking. About Harold and the cardboard sign that had changed everything. About the faces I'd memorized over 3 years of walking, each one a person with a story that mattered. About the weight of other people's hunger and the impossible mathematics of need versus resources. I started with one man, I heard myself saying, and before I knew it, I was responsible for dozens. I wanted to help everyone, but I couldn't. I'm just one person and I'm not even young anymore. Tell me about today, Jessica said gently, and something in her voice made me think she already knew. So I told her. About loading the cart with 30 meals, about my hip locking up and my vision going spotty, about the wheel breaking and the food scattering across the sidewalk like accusations. About sitting on the concrete watching apples get flattened by cars while a concerned jogger tried to salvage my dignity along with the damaged groceries. I broke my cart today, I finally admitted, the words feeling like a confession. I couldn't even deliver the food I'd promised. They were counting on me and I let them down. Margaret, Jessica said, and something about the way she said my name made me pay attention. How many people have you fed in the past 3 years? I'd never counted. It seemed beside the point, like counting raindrops or stars or all the small kindnesses that make life bearable. I don't know, I said. Maybe 1,000 meals? Maybe more. 1,000 meals, she repeated, and I could hear her writing something down. One person delivering 1,000 meals to people who had nowhere else to turn. Do you realize what that means? It means I'm an old woman who got in over her head, I thought. It means I bit off more than I could chew and nearly choked on my own good intentions. It means you've been doing the work of angels, Jessica said. And now you don't have to do it alone. She explained that she'd been working on a senior project about food insecurity in urban areas. She'd been interviewing homeless individuals about their experiences with various services, and Harold's name had come up, then Maria's, then Frank's. Each of them had mentioned the same woman, an older lady with a cart who brought not just food but dignity, who sat with them on sidewalks and treated them like human beings instead of problems to be solved. I started asking around and everyone knew about you, Jessica said. The lady with the cart who shows up when no one else will. The grandmother who walks miles every day just to make sure people don't go hungry. Grandmother. The word hit me like a physical blow. I was a grandmother, had been for years, but my own grandchildren lived hundreds of miles away and saw me maybe twice a year. These people, these strangers I'd met on street corners and under bridges, they'd become my family in ways I hadn't even realized. I want to organize a network of volunteers, Jessica continued. Students from the social work program, people from local churches, retirees who want to make a difference. We can fix your cart or get you a new one. We can organize routes so no one person has to walk 10 miles. We can coordinate with local businesses for donations, connect people with services they're eligible for, turn what you've been doing into something sustainable. I wanted to say yes. Every fiber of my being wanted to say yes. But I also wanted to protect what I'd built. These weren't just clients or cases to me. They were Harold and Maria and Frank and dozens of others who'd become part of my daily prayer list. They trusted me. They knew I'd show up even when showing up nearly killed me. What if these volunteers don't understand? I was worried. What if they treat my people like problems to be solved instead of humans to be loved? What if they come with clipboards and regulations and all the bureaucratic barriers that keep people hungry in the first place? Margaret. Jessica's voice was gentle. Are you still there? I'm here, I said, though I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, afraid to jump and afraid to stay. I know this is scary, she said, as if she could read my thoughts through the phone line. I know you've been doing this alone for a long time and trusting other people with something so important feels impossible. But Harold told me something today that I think you need to hear. I waited, holding my breath. He said you saved his life. Not just by bringing him food but by seeing him. By sitting with him on the sidewalk and treating him like he mattered. He said you gave him back his dignity when everyone else looked through him like he was invisible. The tears came then, hot and unexpected. I'd been so focused on my failures that I'd forgotten why I'd started this in the first place. I'd forgotten that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't food or money or solutions, but simply the acknowledgement that they exist. But he also said he's worried about you, Jessica continued. He said you're killing yourself trying to save everyone else. He said he prays every night that God will send you help because losing you would be like losing hope itself. Harold prays for me? The thought was overwhelming. I'd spent 3 years praying for him, for all of them, asking God to keep them safe and fed and warm. I'd never considered that they might be praying for me too. He told me about your cart breaking today, Jessica said. He was there, wasn't he? He saw it happen. How did you? He called me. Well, he had someone else call me from a payphone. He was crying, Margaret. This tough old man who's survived things most of us can't imagine, and he was crying because he was afraid you'd give up. Afraid that breaking your cart would break your spirit too. I looked at the broken cart leaning against my wall, its twisted wheel and bent handle suddenly looking less like symbols of failure and more like battle scars from a war worth fighting. He wanted me to tell you something, Jessica said. He wanted me to tell you that it's okay to accept help. That even angels need wings to fly. Even angels need wings to fly. The words echoed in my mind like a bell tolling, like a prayer being answered, like a door opening that I hadn't even known was there. So what do you say? Jessica asked. Will you let us help you help them? I looked around my kitchen, at the empty soup cans I'd been saving for my next batch, at the notebook where I'd written down everyone's favorite foods and their stories, at the calendar where I'd marked the days I'd missed my route because I was too tired to walk but too guilty to rest. I thought about Harold's pale blue eyes and the way he'd started smiling when he saw me coming. I thought about Maria's baby and how she'd grown from a tiny infant to a toddler who waved at me from her stroller. I thought about Frank's stories about Vietnam and his quiet dignity that never wavered even when everything else did. I thought about all the faces I'd memorized over 3 years of walking, all the stories I'd collected, all the promises I'd made and tried to keep. I thought about the mathematics of hunger and the weight of other people's hope and the way purpose had felt like both a blessing and a burden. Maybe I don't have to choose between doing this work and doing it right, I realized. Maybe I can do both. Maybe accepting help isn't giving up. Maybe it's growing up. Yes, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Yes, I'll let you help. The words felt like stepping off that cliff I'd been standing on, like trusting that there would be something to catch me when I fell. Like admitting that even the strongest people need support, that even the most determined hearts need help to keep beating. Thank you, Jessica said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Thank you for trusting us with something so important. Thank you for starting something beautiful and being brave enough to let it grow. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time looking at my broken cart and thinking about Wings. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened with the steady inevitability of seasons changing or wounds healing or hope returning to places where it had been lost. Within a week, Jessica had organized a team of 12 volunteers, social work students who understood systems, retirees who had time and wisdom to spare, people from local churches who'd heard about what we were doing and wanted to be part of something that mattered. They came to my apartment on a Saturday morning, crowding into my small living room with notebooks and maps and an energy that made my walls feel like they might burst from the sheer volume of compassion contained within them. Show us your route, Jessica said, spreading a detailed city map across my coffee table like a general planning a campaign. The paper crackled as she smoothed it flat, and I could see she'd already marked locations with different colored pins. I traced the paths I'd walked for 3 years with my finger, following streets that had become as familiar as the lines on my own palm. Here was Harold's Corner. There was the bridge where Frank sometimes slept when the shelter was full. Over there was the parking lot behind Peterson's Market where Maria had been living in her car. Each location held a story, a face, a memory of connection. The alley where I'd found Tommy passed out from hunger and sat with him until he could stand again. The bus stop where an elderly woman named Rose had told me about her son who died in Afghanistan, how she'd lost her apartment when she couldn't work anymore. The park bench where a young man named David had shown me pictures of the daughter he was trying to get back from foster care. This is incredible, said Bob, a retired teacher who reminded me of my late husband with his gentle eyes and careful way of listening. You've been covering the entire east side of the city. That's got to be 12, maybe 15 miles depending on the route. Someone had to, I said, though saying it out loud made me realize for the first time how impossible it had been. How I'd been trying to be everywhere at once, trying to solve problems that required armies of people and resources I'd never had. We divided the route into manageable sections, drawing boundaries on the map with different colored markers. 2-person teams would cover different areas on different days, but I would still be involved, just not carrying the entire burden alone. We'd meet weekly to coordinate, share stories, and make sure no one was forgotten in the transition. Jessica had brought a brand new cart, sturdy and practical with 4 wheels that actually turned and a handle that didn't require a death grip to control. From all of us, she said when I tried to protest. Consider it an investment in the future. But the most important gift she brought was a thick folder full of resources. Phone numbers for services I'd never heard of, applications for programs that could help people get back on their feet, contact information for social workers and case managers who specialized in homelessness and addiction and mental health issues. We can't just feed people, Jessica explained. We have to help them find ways to feed themselves. That's the difference between charity and change. The first group outing was terrifying in ways I hadn't expected. I'd been so possessive of my relationships with the people I'd been helping that I worried about sharing them with strangers. What if Harold didn't like the new volunteers? What if they said the wrong thing or treated him like a charity case instead of a friend? What if they came with good intentions but no understanding of the dignity required to help someone without destroying their spirit? But I'd underestimated both Harold and the volunteers. Margaret. Harold's face lit up like Christmas morning when he saw me approaching Jessica and a social work student named David. You brought friends. Within minutes, Jessica was sitting on the ground beside him, listening to his stories with the same attention and respect I'd tried to give them. David was sharing photos of his own grandfather, a Korean War veteran, And Harold was nodding with the recognition of someone who'd found a kindred spirit. I've been trying to get my disability benefits straightened out for 2 years, Harold told David. But every time I go to the VA they tell me I need different paperwork, and by the time I get it, the person I was supposed to see has moved to a different department. David pulled out his phone and started making notes. I know someone who can help with that. My supervisor at school used to work at the VA. Let me make some calls. He's not just my friend, I realized, watching Harold's face brighten with something I hadn't seen there before. Hope for actual change instead of just daily survival. He's capable of making new friends too. He has needs I can't meet and dreams I can't help him achieve. The same thing happened at every stop. Maria lit up when she met Carmen, a bilingual social worker who could communicate with her in rapid Spanish and understand the cultural barriers that had kept her from accessing services. Frank connected immediately with Bob, another veteran who understood things about war and survival that I could only sympathize with from a distance. I'd been so focused on being needed that I'd forgotten these people had needs I couldn't meet. Harold needed someone who could help him navigate the labyrinthine Veterans Services system. Maria needed someone who could help her understand her rights as an undocumented immigrant and find childcare so she could look for work. Frank needed someone who could help him access the disability benefits he'd earned through service to his country. The volunteers brought skills I didn't have: knowledge of systems, connections to resources, languages I couldn't speak, and energy I couldn't sustain anymore. But more than that, they brought something I'd lost somewhere along the way in my 3 years of solitary walking: hope that problems could actually be solved instead of just managed. Over the months that followed, our little network grew like a living thing, putting down roots and sending out shoots in directions I never could have imagined. Local restaurants started donating day-old bread and soup when Jessica contacted them with official letters on university letterhead. A church opened its doors one night a week for people who needed a warm place to sleep, complete with cots and blankets and volunteers trained in de-escalation techniques. A medical clinic started providing free care to anyone we brought in, staffed by doctors and nurses who understood that health problems don't wait for insurance approval. A legal aid organization began offering free consultations for people trying to get identification documents or navigate government bureaucracy. Most importantly, we started seeing real change in individual lives. I watched Harold get into transitional housing through a program David had found: a clean room with a bed and a bathroom and an address where he could receive mail. I saw Maria find a job at a grocery store where the manager spoke Spanish and understood that reliable childcare was more important than perfect English. I celebrated with Frank when his disability claim was finally approved after Bob helped him gather the military records that had been lost in bureaucratic shuffle for years. I cried with joy when Tommy got into a rehabilitation program that treated addiction as a disease instead of a moral failing. Not everyone's story had a fairy tale ending. Some people disappeared, moving on to other cities or other circumstances before we could help them find stability. Others struggled with mental illness or addiction in ways that food and kindness and even professional intervention couldn't fix. Some were too proud to accept help, too afraid to trust systems that had failed them before, too broken by years of living rough to believe that change was possible. But even those stories mattered. Even those people mattered. And now, instead of carrying the weight of every unsolved problem by myself, I had 11 other people to help me bear the burden and celebrate the victories. My body started to heal too, slowly but noticeably. With the walking divided among 12 people instead of 1, my hip stopped its constant screaming protest and settled back into the manageable ache of normal arthritis. My hands stopped shaking once I wasn't carrying heavy loads for miles every day. I could sleep through the night without dreams of scattered soup cans and broken promises. But the best change was in my heart. I'd spent so long trying to be everything to everyone that I'd forgotten the joy of being part of something bigger than myself. I wasn't Margaret the savior anymore, the lone woman warrior against hunger and homelessness. I was Margaret the connector, the one who'd started something beautiful and then been wise enough to let it grow beyond what any one person could sustain. My children noticed the change during our weekly phone calls. "You sound different, Mom," Sarah said one Sunday evening. "Happier. Less frantic." "I am happier," I told her and realized it was true. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't constantly calculating how many more meals I could provide if I just pushed myself a little harder. I wasn't lying awake at night wondering if Harold had found somewhere warm to sleep or if Maria's baby had enough formula. I was still worried about them, I probably always would be, but now I knew that 12 other people were worried about them too. 12 other people were looking out for them, advocating for them, working to address not just their immediate needs but the systemic problems that had put them on the streets in the first place. On the first anniversary of meeting Jessica, we held a small celebration in Riverside Park. Volunteers, current and former clients, supporters from churches and businesses, and a few social work professors who'd heard about our grassroots network gathered around picnic tables loaded with food donated by every restaurant within 5 miles. I looked around at the faces, some familiar from my solitary walks, others new to the extended family we'd created. Harold was there in clean clothes and a new haircut, telling stories to a group of students who hung on every word. Maria brought her daughter, now walking and chattering in both Spanish and English, charming everyone with her giggle and her fearless exploration of the playground. Frank arrived in his own car, a beat-up Honda he'd bought with his first disability check, wearing his Purple Heart and a smile that had taken months to reappear. Tommy was 6 months clean and working at a coffee shop, saving money for his own apartment and talking about maybe going back to school. But there were also new faces, people who'd been found by our expanded network and were just beginning their own journeys toward stability. The cycle continued, but now it was sustainable, supported by systems and resources instead of just one old woman's determination. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange that reminded me of hope itself, Harold found me sitting on a bench, watching the celebration unfold around us. "I have something for you," he said, pressing a small wrapped package into my hands with the ceremony of someone presenting a Medal of Honor. Inside was a photograph I'd never seen before. It showed me from that first day we met, sitting on the sidewalk beside him outside the bank sharing my sandwich. I looked tired in the photo, older than I'd realized at the time, but there was something in my eyes that I'd forgotten about. Purpose, determination, the fierce love of someone who'd finally found her calling. "I kept it all this time," Harold said, his voice soft with emotion. "Maria took it with her phone that day and I asked her to print it for me. I wanted you to remember the day you saved my life." I studied the photograph, the woman I'd been 3 years ago, carrying the weight of everyone's hunger on her shoulders. She looked determined but fragile, like she might break under the pressure of her own compassion. She had no idea what she was starting, no concept of how far her simple act of sharing would ripple outward. "You know what I see when I look at this?" I said to Harold, tracing the edge of the photo with my finger. "What?" "The day you saved mine." Because that's what had happened. Harold hadn't just been the first person I'd helped, he'd been the first person who'd helped me remember who I was. Not the invisible older woman disappearing into routine and irrelevance, but someone who could make a difference. Someone who mattered. Someone whose story wasn't finished being written. The work continues, of course. Every week I walk shorter routes with different partners, carrying less food but somehow feeding more people. The network has grown to include 50 volunteers and serves over 200 people regularly through direct outreach, resource connection, and advocacy work that's starting to influence city policy on homelessness and food insecurity. I still worry about the people we can't reach, about the problems we can't solve, about the day when I'll be too old to walk even the shortened routes. But I've learned that worry can be a form of prayer, and prayer can be a form of action, and action can multiply in ways that individual effort never can. My children visit more often now, bringing my grandchildren to meet the extended family I've found in this work. They're proud of what I've built, but more than that, they're proud of who I've become. Not the mother who sacrificed everything for others at the expense of her own health and happiness, but the woman who found a way to care for others while caring for herself. "You're going to be okay, aren't you, Mom?" Michael asked during his last visit, watching me interact with the volunteers who'd become like additional children to me. "I'm going to be more than okay," I told him. "I'm going to be useful for as long as God gives me breath to walk and hands to serve." And I meant it. Because I'd learned something important in those 3 years of walking alone and the months of walking with others. Purpose doesn't have an expiration date, but it does require community to sustain it. Love doesn't diminish when it's shared, it multiplies. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give to the people you're trying to help is the gift of helping you help them. The broken cart sits in my closet now, retired but not forgotten. Sometimes I look at its twisted wheel and bent handle and remember what it felt like to carry the weight of the world on wheels that were never designed for such a load. But mostly I remember what it taught me, that breaking isn't always failing and failing isn't always the end of the story. Sometimes breaking is just the first step toward building something stronger. 3 years ago I thought I was invisible. I thought my story was over, that the most important chapters of my life had been written and closed, filed away like old tax returns or childhood photo albums. I was wrong about so many things. The most important chapter began the day I stopped walking past Harold's Corner, the day I realized that seeing people, really seeing them, was the first step to saving them. And maybe, in the process, saving myself from a life that had become too small for the love I had to give. I still walk every day, though not as far and never alone. I still carry food to people who need it, though now I also carry hope. The knowledge that one person's compassion can multiply into something extraordinary when it's nurtured by the community and sustained by systems that work. My hip still aches on rainy days, reminding me that I'm mortal and my time is finite. My hands still show the lines of 67 years of living, the roadmap of a life fully lived. But my heart feels younger than it has in decades, filled with the faces of friends who started as strangers and the certainty that every step I take still matters. The work isn't finished. It never will be. Hunger and homelessness and hopelessness don't disappear just because a group of determined people decide to fight them. But it's no longer mine alone to carry, and that makes all the difference between sustainability and burnout, between individual heroics and systemic change. I've learned that you don't have to be young to start over, you don't have to be perfect to make a difference, and you don't have to be alone to be strong. I've learned that accepting help isn't admitting defeat. It's admitting that some problems are too big for any one person to solve but not too big for a community of people who care. Most importantly, I've learned that purpose doesn't end when your children grow up, when your spouse dies, or when your body starts to show its age. Purpose just changes shape, adapts to your circumstances,